Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Beth Powers, and I'm an Associate Director on the Columbia Justice Lab's Youth Justice Initiatives team. Our project aims to create a world where all youth, particularly youth of color and those who have long been marginalized, have the opportunities and supports they need to grow, flourish, and thrive in their own homes and communities outside of the legal system. Today's panel on shifting resources to communities is the sixth event in our Taking On Transformation series, which outlines key steps for system leaders across the country to consider as they shift away from the youth prison model and create a community-centered approach. To find out more about this series and to watch recordings of our past panels, visit our website at takingontransformation.org. Today's webinar is co-hosted by the Youth Correctional Leaders for Justice, an affinity group of current and past youth justice administrators calling for an end to youth prisons and pushing for investments in communities. Today's conversation will dive into some of the things that communities need in order to fully support young people and how to get those resources to them in order to truly transform youth justice and shift both power and responsibility from systems to communities. Before diving into today's topic, we want to thank our partners and funders, without whom we could not do this work. I also want to remind everyone that even though this will remain a closed panel, we will aim to reserve time at the end for the panelists to answer questions. Please use the Q&A feature in your webinar control panel to submit questions at any time throughout the discussion, as we may not see questions posted directly into the chat. Lastly, we will record this event and post it on our project website at takingontransformation.org, where you can also watch past panels. Our moderator for today's panel is Courtney Sanders. Courtney is Senior Manager of State and Policy Analysis on the State Fiscal Policy Team at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Her work focuses on state fiscal policy through a racial equity lens. She also provides technical support to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities State Priorities Partnership to build partners' capacity to conduct research and analysis through an equitable lens. I'll turn it over to Courtney to introduce the panelists and get us going.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you everyone for joining us and being a part of this incredible conversation. First, before we begin diving into the panel, I would love to take the opportunity to introduce these powerful and dynamic speakers. First, we have Yannick Wood, who is the director of the Criminal Justice Reform Program at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. In his capacity, he manages the Institute's efforts to transform New Jersey's youth incarceration system and creates initiatives to keep law enforcement accountable to the communities in which they serve. Next, we have Terry Williams, who is the Chief Development Officer for Community Solutions Incorporated, also known as CSI, a national nonprofit agency serving system-involved individuals, youth, and families. In her previous role overseeing the executive branch juvenile justice continuum in Kansas, she helped lead comprehensive research-based juvenile justice policy and legislative reforms. She is currently serving as the chair of the Kansas State Advisory Group on Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Last but certainly not least, we have Valerie Salter, who is a youth justice attorney and the executive director for Rise for Youth, where she advocates for the rights of system-involved youth. Valerie has also worked to protect the rights of children with disabilities in community, residential, and juvenile justice facilities throughout the Commonwealth at the Disability Law Center of Virginia. And Valerie earned her JD from the University of Richmond School of Law and her bachelor's from Chicago State University. Valerie brings to her work an unwavering commitment to strengthening youth and communities to lead the efforts to realize their visions for change. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this panel where we're going to really dive into why reinvesting is important. And I couldn't be happier to have this panel with such an excellent group of people. So let's set the stage a little bit, right? First, define what we're talking about here. Why is shifting resources and power to support and advance what youth and communities need and want, and why that's so important, and what has this look like in each of your jurisdictions? where legislation has been passed for this purpose. I'm going to start with Terry. Tell me a little bit more about what this looks like for you and where you are.
Great. Thanks, Courtney. So when our legislation passed in Kansas, one of the core changes in our system was to create a reinvestment fund, which I'll talk about a little bit in detail later. But Kansas, through this fund, was able to redirect roughly $15 to $20 million a year, which had previously been spent on residential and correctional placements. These funds were expressly to be used to establish programs and services in communities to benefit impacted youth. And this was important because communities wanted to serve kids and wanted to serve kids at home safely. But our system was structured such that we spent so much money on deep end placements that sufficient funds were not available for such purposes. And during the hearings for this bill and since the passage, there's really a lot of discussion about the absolute importance of consistent and steady investment into this fund in order to see the positive impact for youth and communities. So meaning if the money wasn't there, the changes would fail. And because of this, the legislature enacted a lockbox provision to the bill, which was established to help protect it from budget sweeps.
Yeah, thank you so much, Terry. And I like that last part you said about, and if the money wasn't there, we wouldn't even see all the amazing impact that has been happening in so many youth lives. Valerie, you've also noticed that too, right? Why is shifting resources and power to support and advance what youth and communities need so important?
Thank you, Courtney, and just so glad to be here with you all today. And so when we start talking about communities and young people and the need to shift the power and the resources to them, who knows better what a community needs than the members of that community? It's way too often that folks are attempting to provide the fix rather than inviting those harmed, those experiencing whatever the wrong is, inviting them to the table and saying, hey, be a part of this change. Come and let us, empower you through the resources and through the shifting of the decision making to you so that you can be a part of formulating your own solutions. That's why it's so incredibly important. But then, like Terry just shared, if the finances aren't there, if the money's not there, I don't care how many changes you dream, until you've got the resources to realize those changes, they're just not going to happen. And I would just like to give one quick example. So when the pandemic first kicked off, if you will, and everyone went into lockdown, no one felt that harder than those families of incarcerated children. These families all of a sudden had lost all communication ability with their children who were behind bars. And so often families were calling Rise for Youth saying, hey, do you have the opportunity to talk to my kids? Can you get a message to my children? So what we did was we created a safe space for family members of incarcerated children. And, we created a Zoom room for them to meet once a week. And families were coming together and they were sharing woes, of course, but then also encouraging each other. But they were also lifting up their specific challenges. And one of those challenges was that the state was requiring them to pay child support to the, DJJ would send them that child support order once their child was incarcerated. And so once we learned that that was an issue, we worked with families to end that process. And so in 2021, we submitted the legislation through one of our champions at the legislature, Delegate Patrick Hope, and he carried that bill, fought hard for that bill, and it passed. But it was the voices of community that said, this is what we need. And then we were able to stand beside them, allow them to amplify their voices, and then stop that practice.
Yeah, thank you so much, Valerie, for grounding us in that example, right? Because it's important because it is the lived experience of so many families that talks about that dire need for a shift in resources. And Yannick, you know about that as well, as you have direct engagement with the community. So why is shifting resources and power to support and advance youth and communities and what they need so important?
Yeah, thank you so much, Courtney, and thank you, Terry and Valerie, for talking about your examples. I echo everything that you've said. I, I think that for too long we've had a top-down approach with government telling communities the needs of the communities and coming up with solutions, or what the government determined what the solutions would be. And in New Jersey, in New Jersey, we have some of the worst racial disparities when it comes to youth incarceration. And then that's using the old model. So for example, there's an 18-to-1 racial disparity in the ratio with which we incarcerate Black kids as opposed to white kids, even though both Black and white youth commit most offenses at similar rates. And we pay currently over $600,000 to incarcerate a single child. So that's the top-down approach. So we need to come up with a different approach. And a different approach is empowering communities, like Valerie was talking about, because these communities know exactly what's going on, and they know what the solutions for the issues that are going on. So at the Institute, we helped draft and champion a particular bill. It was Restorative and Transformative Justice for Youths and Communities pilot program bill. So it's a mouthful, but it passed last year, and it was channeling $8.4 million back into particular communities for restorative justice programs and wraparound reentry programs to provide youth with services from credible messengers, people that the youth can actually know, understand, and respect. And that's after workshopping this idea with community members to figure out where there were deficits and how community were being supported. Yeah, definitely we need to start from community bottom up to actually come up with real, lasting, enduring solutions for the youth incarceration crisis that we're in right now.
Yeah, thank you. I like that point, because you're talking about the challenge is not just about the shifting of the resources, but it's the disparities and the outcomes that happen when we don't do it. And Valerie was talking a little bit about the challenges about that very thing too. So Valerie, I want to start with you and ask you briefly, what challenges or barriers have you all seen or experienced, particularly when trying to shift resources to communities in ways that center racial justice, that partner with youth and families? What has that been like, right?
Right. So interestingly enough, here in Virginia, and I apologize, we got the dog barking in the background. I do apologize. So when Beaumont, the largest juvenile prison here in Virginia, once it closed, perhaps we'll shift.
I will shift to Terry. Terry, why don't you start and talk about Kansas, right? Which is a little bit different from Virginia and New Jersey, but still the need to think about the challenges or barriers you have seen or you experienced through your own work in centering racial justice and partnering with youth and families.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. So our legislation, which I saw in the QA, someone was asking, and we can send a link to those documents for sure. But our system change was pretty enormous and comprehensive. And so because of that, the implementation of the work has happened incrementally, and that was by design to make sure that each phase could roll out in the way and manner in which it was intended. So as such, the reinvestment fund actually has built up, and there have been some attempts to sweep some of those funds or to use the funds in ways other than which they are intended to be spent. Thus far, it's been unsuccessful, though there's been many at-bats for that. And thankfully, we have some very committed and passionate advocacy groups, some with very strong impacted youth voices, who have worked diligently to help protect those funds and work to educate constituents on the fund's importance. So 6 years later, Kansas has established a network of programs and services, both locally and statewide, which thankfully can be sustained by the annual reinvestment mechanism. And, I just want to point out the importance of that, because if you want to create a system where programs and communities can count on funding, you don't want to create and establish programs that next year we may not have the funds to maintain. As part of our work, incrementally, the counties and regional systems can also apply for grant funding to establish programming based upon their unique community needs. I think our focus now has really been to advocate for more targeted investments in culturally responsive and gender responsive services in communities.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you've identified the challenges. Even when you have the money, it can be extremely hard to keep it, right? And it can be extremely hard to be strategic about how not only to keep it, but that it's continually going back to community every single year. Every year, there is conversation about whether or not we just get the money, but how we keep the money and how we strategically give back into community. I really like that point. Yannick, I'm going to go to you briefly and hear from you about the challenges or barriers. You mentioned a little bit earlier, but tell us more about when shifting resources to communities in ways that center racial justice. How does that look like in your work and in what you do on a daily basis and what you come up against?
Yes, I think you said it very well about getting money from the government, the government is in the best position to have the purse strings, to have all the funding. Getting that money to the actual organizations, that's a challenge. So with the bill that I outlined, it was kind of complicated. It was money from the general treasury going to state government, it was actually the Juvenile Justice Commission, which is like the agency that oversees youth prisons, and then they were giving that money to county government, and county government was the one that was dispersing it through RFPs to individual service providers. So there's a lot of different state, county government, and county government. Each county, there's 21 counties, not as many as in Terry's state, but each county has its own draconian, arcane, think of any synonym and any adjective that's not so good about the rules for RFPs. And these service providers, which are not, if we really want mom and pop, community-based service providers, they often don't have attorneys. They often don't have grant professionals who focus solely on these types of grants. So that was a challenge, educating the public about these funds, but then also getting the organizations to be able to be in a position to apply for these funds. One recommendation that I think that states should do is, if the state determines that they actually want community-based service providers to actually apply for funds, then they need to have some sort of incubator or some sort of technical expert or a technical expertise that's provided to these service providers, so that way they can actually do an appropriate application and actually get the funding. And then the last thing I'll add is, I know my time is short, but there needs to be dedicated funding for long-term for projects. We can't just fund them for 1 year and say, hey, how come you haven't solved youth incarceration, right? In 1 year, it took generations to get to this, but 1 year you have to fix it. It has to be long-term funding, and that allows these organizations to scale up, to coordinate with each other, to scale up.
I love this. And I love this point too, because oftentimes, to your point, it is the community-based approach or the alternatives to incarceration and those mom and pop shops, if you will, equipped with so much lived experience. Oftentimes these are formerly incarcerated people themselves that want to give back and do more for their community. Yet we know that they're also the ones who are culturally competent. And let's just name what we are saying here is that they're people of color, right? And so when you are having these challenges with the RFPs, or you're having these challenges with filling out applications and all these different things, that is also wrapped in and folded into these other generational things, right? And other barriers that people just face for just being and existing, whether that be in Kansas or New Jersey or even Virginia. So Valerie, I want to come back to you and ask you again about, the challenges or barriers, because Yannick brought up a good point. You are an attorney, so you have this background and knowledge, but I'm sure that there's still challenges for, shifting resources to communities in ways that really center racial justice in Virginia, and challenges on how we can partner better with youth and their families.
Thank you, Courtney. So yeah, we've heard how there's legislation that's been passed and those kinds of things. Virginia did it just a little different. I was talking about how we closed Beaumont, great victory, right? And there was a $40 million surplus that the advocates and even the department successfully advocated so that it would stay in the Department of Juvenile Justice. They got to hold on to that money, but it was earmarked for alternatives, incarceration alternatives. And so there were 2 regional service coordinators hired to look at all of the jurisdictions of Virginia, find those providers that were in community and doing this great work to ensure we could shore up what's called that continuum of services, right? And so then we noticed that it was those larger, already connected to the system, those were the organizations that were getting the funding. And as we went deeper into community and started talking to those partners, those mom and pop shops that we were just talking about, they weren't even aware that this $40 million existed. And so then as we are going through, we're literally hosting events and inviting these regional service coordinators to those events so that those smaller orgs could find out what's available. Then as they are then applying, it may not have been as rigorous as that RFP, but nevertheless, then they've got to do that site visit. You've got to have all of these other pieces in place. And so again, we run into those roadblocks of, are you research-based? Are you research informed? Do you have all of these other pieces that these large system players already have in place? And then we would have folks that would come out and they would do that site visit, and if everything wasn't in order, where was that TA that was coming out to help and say, this is how you shore up what you don't have, this is how you become that robust provider? And the other piece that was really challenging, that continues to be a challenge, is the 2 models of funding. So for the larger organizations that were more established, they would, the funding looked like, you'll serve X number of youth, and here's the money that will pay you on the front end to provide those services. Whereas the smaller orgs, they were being offered, we'll send you a youth if we get one that really tailors to what you've got going on, and then you're going to submit your invoice to this agency, who's going to submit it to that agency. It's going to go to the other agency, and then in a few months you'll get your payment. And so, I like to call it the go out of business quick scheme, right? So there's a couple of challenges. We're continuing to fight the good fight, and it's not that they don't want to help. Right? It's not that they don't want these larger or these smaller spaces to have, but we've just got to do better at making those funds accessible.
Right. It's not enough to just have the legislation for the resources to be there, right? And that's what I'm hearing from you. And Valerie, I want to keep with you for a second, because one thing I have admired the most about your work over your tenure is just your dedication to community. And from a community advocate perspective, what resources have you tried to shift from the system to the impacted communities in your area? So, we're talking about the mechanism side of things for the past few conversations, but what we say resources, but what does that really mean? Like, what is a resource? And especially, what is a resource for the communities that you serve?
Sure. So, we just launched a campaign at Rise for Youth, and it's called Redefine the Vital Signs. And it's all about taking a public health approach to public safety from the community's perspective. So we have done this amazing job of allowing the system or the government to define the problem. Oh, these violent communities. Oh, these communities where, everyone is just running and wreaking havoc and nothing is in order. And then they prescribe police, and they prescribe jail, and they prescribe prison. And so we're saying, give that power to community. Let that main resource of even defining what healthy looks like, give that to the community. Let them define what the issues are and what solutions are. So often I give the analogy, if you have healthy soil, you can anticipate that you will grow healthy plants. But if you have unhealthy soil, even if you pluck a plant out of that soil and you put it in some healthy soil for a while, that plant may revive and thrive for a minute. But if you don't do anything to that soil where that plant originally came from, and you attempt to replant that plant back into that original soil, then you can't be upset if it then begins to deteriorate again. You can't be upset about it. Well, we have communities that we have allowed, the systems have allowed to breed unhealthy soil. And now we have horticulturalists in community, the best horticulturalists for any given community are those who live within it. If we want to know how to grow something in Hawaiian soil, then we need to talk to someone who lives in Hawaii. Well, if we want to know how best to serve children in Richmond, we need to talk to Richmonders. We don't need to talk to anyone from Northern Virginia. We don't need to talk to someone with deep pockets. We need to talk to those on the ground living it, and then allow them to not only come up with solutions, but then provide the resources. And so this campaign is going around to all parts of the Commonwealth. We can drill down to actual zip codes in Virginia if we wanted to know exactly who's getting sent to prison. We can do that, right? And so we are focusing on those communities, and we are saying, tell us what is needed. Now, and just like we did with that bill to end the collection of child support, we intend to take that rich knowledge that comes from community and get with some legislators and draft some legislation and make some real change happen. And we don't want just legislation that's word. We need legislation with funds attached to it,
Yes.
so that actual change can happen. So that's what we're doing right now. We've got a campaign, and we have invested and brought on board so many partners, to include the health department, right? We have included all of these partners who are on the ground, who are, even if they are systems players, they're invested in seeing community take lead.
Yeah, I want to keep you just for 1 minute, and that we have a lot more questions to go, so I'm not going to have you speak for too long. But first of all, I love that flower analogy. I love that plant analogy. And you all, if you're participating right now live, show some love to Valerie on that analogy. I think we can all adopt some of that in our own work, regardless of issue area that we're focusing on. But Valerie, you said something. You said, this can't be something that we are outsourcing information for. And I understand oftentimes, especially in your advocacy work, that there are challenges and there are successes in doing that. So where have the challenges and successes been that you've seen so far, whether that's with this campaign or with other work that you're doing to shift resources into communities through the advocacy lens?
Sure. So I want to talk about one of the challenges first. We have been looking at the placement of our Department of Juvenile Justice. It's in the Secretary of Public Safety and Homeland Security. Public Safety and Homeland Security. That's where we talk about terrorist threats, right? That's where we talk about incarceration. While every other child serving agency in the Commonwealth of Virginia is in the Secretary of Health and Human Resources. And so we submitted legislation this past session that said, let's convene a work group to study moving the department. right? It's no small feat to move an entire department from one secretary to the next. You've got to study that thing first, ensure that you're doing it in a way that doesn't cause harm, right? We recognize the dynamic, what's happening in our administration. We've worked very hard. We were able to get it passed through our legislature, both on the House and the Senate side, and then it was vetoed by our governor. And so that was a challenge, right? A challenge because all we're saying is, let's look at this. Can we have a paradigm shift in the way that we're thinking about children who find themselves in trouble? If we're really looking at the communities that are sending kids to jail, we'll learn some things. We'll learn that there are some very real public health issues happening there. There are public health crises that are happening on the ground. If we can say that racism is a public health crisis, why are we not then saying, because we are sending more Black youth to prison than anyone else, why isn't justice system involvement a health crisis in Virginia? And so we're wanting to shift that. And unfortunately, we were not able this past session, but we will continue to fight for it. And then if I were to lift up one of our successes, just that we have been able to partner with several of our Commonwealth Attorney's offices to begin restorative justice hubs. And we are now shifting so many cases that would land so many young people in front of a judge and perhaps even incarcerated. They are now coming in through the restorative justice process. And so that is a huge success for us here in Virginia.
Yeah, I love that. And, you know, restorative justice is something we say, but we don't practice, right? Oh, we need it. We need it. And there's something about restorative justice that I tell a lot of people is that time is one of the most valuable resources. And if we can make sure that someone is having time spent in their community versus being incarcerated through restorative justice, why not? Why not? So Valerie, I love that. I think that that is a huge success. And if we start to look at restorative justice as time with family, time within community, time in school for so many youth and so many system involved people, right? That like when you anchor in restorative justice versus straight to carceral, you know, options, then you are giving someone time. And so I really love that. I think that's a huge success. I want to turn to Terry because Valerie talked a lot about what the system is doing as a person that's outside of the system. Mm-hmm. But Terry, you've seen all sides of it, right? So what do system leaders need to do at the outset when they begin a process like this? And how can impacted youth and families be part of that process?
Great. Yeah, so in Kansas, we realized that we needed to take a comprehensive, systemic, and inclusive view of our juvenile justice system. And to do this, it required that we acknowledge that we had to be data-driven, focused on best practices, but probably more importantly, we had to be open to new ideas. We had to accept that some of our practices were actually causing great harm to youth and communities. And then we had to accept responsibility to change what we knew was broken, right? So for us, we found it very helpful to seek out some national partners and experts, such as the Council of State Government, Pew Charitable Trust, and those groups helped us immensely to be able to not only look at our internal policies and practices, but to collect and analyze our system data, and ultimately revamp our entire juvenile justice code. And as far as the inclusion of impacted youth and families, so as part of our work, we established a juvenile justice work group, and somebody had asked in the question, was part of this change led by juvenile justice staff or communities? And the answer is all of the above. But as part of that process, we set up a network of focus groups throughout the state for stakeholders. And of course, these groups, included the usual suspects like judges and law enforcement and probation staff. But we are also very intentional to include stakeholder groups of youth at various points in the system. So for instance, having conversations with youth at our correctional facilities and our group home, out-of-home placements, youth on probation, youth advocates, and youth involved in our child welfare system, as well as family members. And what was really notable and interesting is that in those focus groups, was everyone identified a need for more community-based services, which would allow us to serve youth in their homes and communities safely and effectively. And I think having that universal focus and agreement on those issues was really helpful for messaging the need for the reinvestment process. And then as our work of the Juvenile Justice Work Group culminated into a bill, which was introduced in the legislature, we connected with impacted youth and youth advocacy programs to invite them to share their experiences and give their testimony to legislators who frankly normally only get to hear from individuals who are paid to work with youth and families. And suffice it to say that their voice was really instrumental in counteracting narrative, which was really focused on trying to maintain the status quo. And I think that their stories and experiences were ultimately vital in helping to ensure that the bill became law.
Yeah, I love that. I think oftentimes people think, because I'm not a lawmaker or because I'm not a part of the government, my voice can't be heard.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've learned over the years in my own work is that advocacy can start at every point of the governmental process through legislation and government and reallocating resources. And for Kansas, in this particular instance, there are even more ways to be a part of the conversation because of all of the committees and
Mm-hmm.
groups and things like that you all provide to talk about this issue. The other question I had, just thinking about it, is how can system leaders advocate for shifting power, right? So we talked a little bit about how the advocates or the people in the community and their families are shifting power, but how can system leaders advocate for shifting that power and resources out of their very systems that they
Mm-hmm.
run? And what are the potential challenges and opportunities there? Like, they're like, oh, okay, we looked ourselves in the mirror, but can you give up the power too?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the good news, right, is that system leaders often have great ability to make internal changes in policies and in practices. And those changes can yield system improvements irrespective of whether legislation is passed. I think, to make that change, you have to be willing to be vulnerable, to be transparent, and honest about things that really need to be fixed. So kind of part of the quote from Maya Angelou, when you know better, do better, right? So we knew better, so we had to do better. And publicly articulating that need for change, including to your staff, so they understand, like, this is the goal. We really have the privilege of having these positions and can impact change and change the trajectory of our system and our communities. So part of that is creating a compelling story, and that's important to gain support from internal and external stakeholders. So for instance, in 2011, Kansas ranked ninth highest nationally per capita in out-of-home placements for justice-involved youth. And that was a statistic that was really hard to explain, because why would Kansas, of all states, be ranked so high compared to other states across the nation and even regionally? And other data points that we had to come to wrestle with, if you will, is that we were spending the vast majority of our resources on deep end residential and custody-based placements, so to the tune of like $53 million a year. And those programs were not producing long-term positive outcomes for kids. We lacked a continuum of community-based services, again, because we were spending so much money on the deeper end of the system. And like so many systems, we were plagued by the lack of data. to be able to begin to analyze and problem solve those practices and shift resources. So we did some of that work internally, but sometimes we sought outside help. And as I mentioned, some of those national resources and groups that we worked with really gave us resources and bandwidth to help create change. It helped us connect more with various youth serving organizations and advocacy groups in a deeper and more meaningful way, because sadly we were not doing that, and that was something we needed to fix or improve. And it also helped us establish data and statistics, which helped us paint that compelling picture. So the data was really clear, right? So we were having lower level offenses. So a greater proportion of our kids year after year were misdemeanors compared to felonies, but we were keeping kids on probation longer. Well, that's counterintuitive. The bulk of the youth that we served were low and moderate risk youth. But services weren't available in the community, and circumstances weren't such that would preclude them from entering any part of the system, including deep end placements. Our AWOLs, or absent without leaves, were very high, and just lots of our practices were out of step with industry standards and research. And so the opportunity that these new laws created is really, again, the establishment of our reinvestment fund to redirect those very expensive and services that don't yield great results into community-based services to the tune of 15 to 20 million a year. And that helped us create a continuum of services statewide, which in states like Kansas, the concept of justice by geography is a real thing, right? So there's some communities that do have, no one has all the services that they want to have, but there are communities that have more than others. But those youth are no less deserving of assistance in maintaining in their home than youth who happen to live in a different zip code or county. And so that also created a mechanism for local agencies to do individual assessments of system gaps and establish applications for grants to meet unique local needs, which I think the department worked hard, particularly in later years, to simplify that application process for some of the reasons you mentioned earlier. And the great news is the results of all of that have been incredible. So we've seen a roughly 50% reduction in correctional facility placements, a 90% reduction in group home placements, and public safety hasn't been compromised, and in some ways it's improved. So that includes a reduction of our AWOLs. So those are kids that we can't account for. They've left group homes or placements and we don't know where they're at. And that went from 103 to 7, which is almost a 95% reduction. And our juvenile arrests from fiscal year 15 to 20 were cut by over 50%.
Wow, that's incredible. What Terry did, just to recap you all, was tell you the system leaders, by just using the system itself, failed over and over and over and over and over again. And the same 90% of incarcerating youth flipped over when you had the reinvestment fund, when you had the oversight committee, when you had people from the community actually starting to get input, and that we stopped incarcerating youth in Kansas. That 90% became a 90% reduction, right? And it was success after success after success after success. Thank you, Terry, for just breaking that down for us and really making it very clear. When system folk, when those leaders give up power, it is not a loss, but it is a win for the state, for the community, and certainly the youth. Yannick, I want to come to you, right? Because NJISJ aims to empower people of color by building reparative systems that create wealth, transform justice, and harness democratic power, right? And doing so from the ground up. In New Jersey, your organization's mission involves creating wealth and harnessing democracy. And just from hearing Valerie and Terry's perspective, I think there's this other shift, right? This three-legged stool. We're talking from the government side, from the advocacy side, but then from your side is, how can doing that shift in power or resources from systems to communities harness democracy, right? Harness this idea of creating a better outcome? And what role do you see systems playing, if any, in youth justice specifically?
Yeah. Actually, before I answer that question, I do want to say something. Like before I was an advocate, like in a past life, I was a prosecutor, and um I found that it required me to make a choice in my cases, that notwithstanding the fact that this was a young person, notwithstanding the fact that this was a violent offense, it was very messy facts and circumstances and cases and all that stuff, to make a choice that incarceration was not going to be the end result. And it involves people sometimes going against like the bulwark, going against the inertia of their agency to make that choice in their individual cases, the people who do have the power to do that. And once you make that choice, and it makes it easier for, in my situations, to find mental health programs, for placements in outpatient or inpatient mental health programs, rather than incarceration, even though it was a violent offenses. So that choice was the most important thing. I think in being an advocate right now, and what we do at the Institute, is we have lots of focus groups with community members. When we are interested in taking up a particular policy position, we workshop it with people who are impacted. And that, just last week, there was a legislation that a legislator approached us about. And I said, hey, I know you want us to talk about this, right? But we have to bring this in front of a panel of formerly incarcerated people and see what they have to say about it. And sure enough, they came up with some things in the legislation that I didn't even think about, certain things that I thought were like, oh, okay, all right, it was actually like really important stuff. So I think that for us, it's just a matter of giving communities the space to talk about these issues, and then finally using the goodwill and the authority that we have, or the name that we have in the state, to actually influence legislators and have them make the right decisions. So, yeah.
Yes, I 100% agree. And I think, just like, for those that are live right now, I'm seeing in the chat, folks, they understand that. And I really appreciate you just bringing another example to why that's so important. And especially in your previous role, here's the thing, system leaders or folks who are adjacent to the community, but might not necessarily operating in the community, could easily say, well, I'm above this. I am above you. I have worked, I have went to school, I have gotten all these degrees, I've gotten this title, I have been appointed to, and all these things. How is it that you're gonna come up with a great idea? And to the point that you so well, is people who are closest to the problem also has the solution. And I really just appreciate that. So yeah, I want to get back to this question here about, your organization and your mission is involving around creating wealth and harnessing democracy. And I'm curious, again, it's just, how can doing that shift power resources from systems to communities operate in that mission? And what role do you see systems playing, if any, in youth justice specifically?
Yeah. So that's the mission of our organization, and I'm only one part of the organization. So I deal with criminal justice issues, but there's also democracy issues and economic justice issues. And I find in New Jersey, particular, which is one of the wealthiest states, if not the wealthiest state, it goes between New Jersey and Maryland, that there are supreme racial disparities in wealth and income. And that is, as Terry talks about the geography of justice, that type of wealth is centralized in particular communities and not in communities of color. And so I find a lot of times, I have my criminal justice hat on here, but it really is economics. And I mean, there's racism involved in it too, but it's racialized, economics. And so part of what we do is we try to target that racial wealth gap that we have in New Jersey. There's a $300,000 racial wealth gap between the median net wealth of a white family and that of a Black family, $300,000. And that's because of lack of home ownership and government policies over generations, right? So targeting that wealth disparity does involve putting investment into communities. And that investment in communities does involve investment into service providers, and investment to out of school programming for youth, and different things that fall along the continuum of care. That we've been talking a lot about the continuum, but there's a lot of different areas of the continuum that are neglected, and so targeting that racial wealth gap will necessarily implicate the areas of the continuum. I think sometimes, I have to educate members of the government, people in governor's staff and other people about this is what a continuum is. It's not necessarily that we need to put all our eggs into, actually, definitely we don't need to put all our eggs into incarceration or aftercare all the way at the end. But we need to focus on things before. And one thing I do want to highlight is, and I found this all too often as a prosecutor, we talked about diversion after the case already came. And that in my mind, it's not diversion. Diversion is channeling the youth away from the justice system even before they even get to being in a file on my desk as a prosecutor. And that's something that we have to do in New Jersey better, rather than relying on the discretion of prosecutors. We need to actually channel them away so much sooner, and that's something that we don't invest enough in, that we need to do more in. So it was a lot of things I said in there, but it's all a continuum. Everything is one stream. I think when we start looking at the democracy issues, economic issues, and criminal justice issues, essentially it's really all about empowering communities that have been disempowered, that have been marginalized, that have been put, relegated to this state of powerlessness. But it's really taking back the power that we all inherently have, and channeling that into creating policies that are going to help communities. That's what we're all about anyway.
Yeah, and I love that. And I think so many people appreciate, sometimes it's the grounding piece of it, right? As much as we want to change hearts and minds, we know that it's the economic side of things too. And we also know those who are, in frequent contact with the justice system is not by accident. Right? It is the economic and the democratic landscape of these states, of these cities, of these localities that make it harder or easier for a person, depending on the color of their skin, the type of income they have, where they were born, what zip code they live in. And so I really appreciate that point, and I think it resonates very, very well. So everyone, we have about 5 minutes until this discussion is over, and there were several questions. So panelists, I'm going to shift to some of the audience questions, and if we have time, we'll shift back to a few more planned ones. But I'm going to try to put 2 questions in one here. There's a question that talks about, have programs or laws you all have spoken about been replicated or scaled? And can any of this be used for the adult system or outside of the justice systems altogether? Let's start there.
So I think, the great news is that transformation of juvenile justice systems that align with best practices is a bipartisan issue. I think we've found, whether people come to the table because they think it's right for kids and families, or because they think it's data supported, or because they think that it's much less costly to get better outcomes. It's who cares how folks come to the table, right? It's just that they eat and partake. And so, like in Kansas, our legislation passed nearly unanimously. And that's something, that everyone can connect with, finding that commonality. So I think that this process has been taken on by a number of states throughout the country, but it's still the minority. But I think it is scalable. I mean, it's a process that is, it's not easy, right? You have to do that work. But I think if you're willing to take a look at your systems and involve, communities and be open to that input from folks that perhaps we have marginalized or ignored in the past, for some of the reasons that folks have mentioned beforehand, I think it absolutely is scalable.
Yeah, and Terry, while you're here, there was another question that was related to the Kansas work, where someone asked, was requiring evidence-based programming a barrier for CBOs, and were nonprofits allowed to apply for RFPs in Kansas and the other places you spoke about? Is there more information on incubator programs or good procurement practices? So it looks like there's a question in there for Yannick and Valerie about the incubator work, but then the requirement of like the research evidence-based piece, how does that work in the RFPs for Kansas?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a little, it's done a little bit differently because communities, identify system gaps, and then funds are granted to them for various projects in some instances. And there is some differences amongst counties as to how they then distribute those funds to their local jurisdictions. The state did, and I've been out, of the state now for a few years. So, they've changed some processes to the better, I think, in many ways, like simplifying that process, for applications. And those are the application then that some nonprofits can apply for and fill out versus a whole full-blown RFP. And I do think that there have been, they focus on services that are not just evidence-based promising practices, but that can include all sorts of different, services and programs, including programs like Credible Messengers and things like that. So, I think communities have seen some unique, more grassroots organizations put forth some unique and creative solutions based upon the community's needs.
Yeah.
We can always do better, right? And it's a process, but I have seen improvement in that area. But the constant education, I think what folks realize or have to realize is that folks who are commissioners of juvenile justice, their tenure is usually about little over 2 years, and legislators turn over very frequently. And so sometimes that's a constant educational piece. But we have, I think there has to be some concerted effort to really keep that message going about what these funds are, how you can apply for them, and how you can connect to the local communities to be able to participate in the process.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Yana, did you want to speak to that question about incubator support? And then Valerie, feel free to go in, and then I'll wrap us up.
Yeah, I'll be brief on this. I think that, if people are having legislation, people on this call are from all across the country. And if you're thinking about legislation, I think you should put it right into the legislation that if you're asking for X amount of money, part of that money or a certain percentage of that needs to be for technical assistance. One thing that we did with ours is what in our legislation we talked about organizations partnering with other organizations in applications. So encouraging partnerships, because that pooling of resources makes it more likely that any given organization would be the recipient of the funds. We also require there to be community sessions, information sessions that goes out in all the different regions to explain, hey, this is what the money is, this is what we're looking for. for particular service providers to be invited. It'll be publicly out there, but also actually targeting people. And also a requirement inside the legislation that these organizations be from the community, be representative of the community. I know you have to be kind of careful about the language when you're talking about like, racial terms, with things like that, but they need to be from the community and not just larger organizations outside there. So we actually put that inside there. And then also one last thing I'm going to say is that just be mindful, this is what happened in New Jersey, that there's a legislation, but then there's also the regulations that are made in pursuant to the legislations, and the regulations might be where the devil is in the details, making sure that that's actually precise enough to target what we're trying to do, and so the money is actually getting into the community that actually the service providers that actually are going to be doing the work in the community. Thank you.
Yes, those details matter, right? They're so important, and I think that is a great, takeaway, if anything, for shifting resources to community and really gaining power. I want to make sure that Valerie, if you wanted to have any final words about any of the questions that were posed to the audience, and then I'll wrap us up for this afternoon.
Sure. I just want to quickly talk about that scaling. As we are moving this restorative justice piece through all the Commonwealth Attorney's offices, it's really important that as each office sets up its restorative justice, it is pulling in community members and making sure it's community members who are trained so that they become circle keepers for their own communities. And as they are also being successful, that they are then able to be used as the model for that next jurisdiction where we're going and saying, hey, have you considered this? And as we continue to just travel from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, we're building the case to be able to then go to the legislature. Sometimes you can't start at the top. Sometimes you've got to go into community to find the way. And so that's what we're having to do. And it's been a pleasure having this conversation with you all today.
Well, excellent. Thank you. Yes. And I think that is a great underscore. I heard some amen in the background from Valerie on that. I just want to thank the panelists again. You all are inspiring. You all are champions and leaders in this work. We could not have done this without you. You all, as audience members, you have their contact information, you know their names, you know organizations that they are a part of. Reach out to us. We are here as a resource, and know that the fight is not over. It's just begun, but it's getting stronger and stronger with you all together. So I'm going to end it there. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for a powerful conversation, and take care, everyone.